Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Doris MANGRUM, your host, and this is Stop the Madness, Practical Ways to Influence the Incarceration Crisis, a series of education in our community. For the next several shows, my guest, or I guess I should say my co-coordinator and comrade, LORA SALL, will be talking about checking the reality. And when you hear that, check the reality, you're probably going to, didn't you mean reality check? No, we're actually going to be checking the reality. And here's what these sessions are going to be about. When you think of check the reality, what we're going to discuss is going to be around like fact checks. Fact checks when they do the politicians and when they make a statement, there's some organization that goes and checks to see whether what they've said has been accurate. Well, we're going to be doing a little bit of a twist on that very same concept around things that we know are the reality and looking at those things and saying what needs to be checked about them, what needs to be redressed, what needs to be re-examined as it pertains to the incarceration crisis. So, Laura, I'm happy to have you with me today. And as we begin to set up this program, one of the things that I'm sure all of our viewers are familiar, or most of them are familiar with, is that there are at least 2.2 million, and I think that number is climbing, who are incarcerated. And that's not even talking about under some other type of community supervision, jails, local jails, etc. But in that number, we have about 1 million who come home every year. Mm-hmm. And of that 1 million who come home every year, or nearly 1 million who come home every year, 2/3 of them are going to go right back into prison because of various policy systems that are in place or not in place to support their successful reentry. And this cycling in and out, if you will, of people is not happening across the country. Well, it is. I shouldn't say that. It's happening across the country, but primarily to a small number of communities that are being inundated. These same communities where scores of people have been taken out for decades. Out of those, a small number of communities, people are returning to those numbers, the same communities. And in those communities, people by and large are not ready for their return. And so this causes the incarceration crisis to do what it has done, mushroom, grow larger and larger. So I thought today we will begin this series of checking the reality around our leadership and what needs to happen. And we're going to look at leadership from some various angles in terms of, what needs to change. But I think we might want to start at the top. People who have the means, who have the power and the position to shift some of the things that are currently happening. Because I'd like to say that the reality is that we've got leadership in place, but by and large, the leadership hasn't done enough to shift the paradigm on the crisis. So can you speak to your thoughts about what could be done at the top tier of our leadership?
This is the perfect time. People are running for the top position in the country, presidency. So this is the perfect time to check their reality. We have people who are running and talking about all that needs to be done and what the issues are. They don't touch on this one very much, talking about incarceration. They might touch on other things, but the money and the signature, the final signature regarding those policies and the money that it can impact what's going on, it's going to come from the top. So now's a really good time to really start pulling their coattails and saying, what about this? All right? What have you been doing about this? Not just what are you going to do if by chance you get in office. What have you been doing for the 2 terms plus more terms, depending on who you're looking at? What have you been doing since you've been there?
I think one of the places that we can check the reality on is we know what's been done. Because that's why we're in the mess that we're in, if you will, with the 3 strikes you're out, with the crime bills, if you will, the $30 billion that was placed, 20 years plus ago to build all of these prisons. Where you building the prisons for? You're building the prisons because you think you're going to have people to put them in. And so you put in them. And then, okay, well, let's assure that we're going to have people to put in them. Let's make some mandatory sentencing. Let's make some 3 strikes, you're out. Let's do these things that are truth in sentencing. So we are assured that there's going to be a cycling in and out, not only into the communities, but in and out of our jails and our prisons. So as we begin to check the reality around our leadership and the powers that they have to change things, we need to now look at, I believe, how do we now reverse this curse that we're under? We're under a curse, if you will, that has followed us now for several decades and has caused us to be the largest nation in the world, on the globe, as it pertains to incarcerating individuals. And then we have a secondary problem, is that we don't help them when they come out so that they can be successful in their transitioning, blocking everything from homes to jobs to support that they need to move forward. So I know that you're working inside of, or have done some work inside of a correctional facility. When you think in terms of leadership in that arena, what comes to mind in terms of the reality that exists among leadership who are the people, the men and women who take care of or to supervise and monitor people whose lives have finds them behind the walls?
Well, you have 2 kinds. You have the people who are involved in the programs. You have the sergeant and the deputies who really are actively involved in both the inmates that are not attending classes, but also the program that is set up for the inmates who can attend classes. And some are mandatory and some are voluntary. But, you know, now the hope is that some of the inmates will one day have a reduction in their sentence if they attend classes. And so you have the leadership there, and then you have the leadership, the sheriff and the other COs and other people who work within the modules and within the cells and the other, separate from the programs themselves. And they'll transport the inmates to the classes and back to the cells. That leadership has a different mindset because they're dealing with the fights, they're dealing with the issues. Yes, the other things that come up. Okay. And then you have the providers, the people who are coming from outside the jails into the jails to provide programs, classes, prayer, coming from just a variety of people. So leadership looks different depending on what area they're
talking about.
Exactly.
I would think that, you know, I've had some experience behind the walls as well, and one of the things that I often experience, or, you know, would just hear, people just tell you the truth. You know, I really don't care whether they come back or not because I need to eat. That's a reality that we have to be honest about. This is many men and women's way of life, how they put bread on their families' tables and keep a roof over their family's head.
You're talking about the people
correctional
who work,
officers, the leadership in those who are going to, you know, oversee our criminal supervision, criminal justice supervision. And so I think that there is a reality that needs to be checked out of one mouth. We're being told and mandated that something needs to change. You know, right down in California, where we had to, you know, make sure that so many people went home. Well, we found a way around that. Well, we put them in our local jails and didn't send as many home as we were mandated to because we found a way to take over the overcrowding. Because at the end of the day, as we check the reality, if we're as successful as we say we want to be with the recidivism rates, a lot of people would lose their jobs.
Absolutely.
A lot of numbers would change in our rural communities because some of those prisons might change or close or downsize so that the numbers are not as great. So there's all of these things that leadership is having to look at that are going to be impacted by what they say or do. So I say that there's probably, And I know for, and I say a fact, having spoken to people who work, who have worked inside or do the work with people whose lives are directly impacted behind the walls, that, at the end of the day, I mean, do I really want them all not to come back? No. I want them to come back so that my livelihood is taken care of.
Well, maybe the people who are working within the walls can start looking at themselves differently.
Absolutely.
So that they can start looking at, okay, if I were not working in this area inside the walls, how can I take this experience and benefit some of the people who are leaving here and help them outside the walls?
I am shaking my head because that's exactly what I would share with folks that would say what I just shared with you and our audience about that. So, look at the expertise that you've gleaned from this work, and now how I can now take it to the other side, because that's all it takes, because you've learned so many things on the inside that you can now take to the outside.
And see, another reality that we're faced with, when we look at check the reality, it's not just people coming home from being incarcerated or being in our local jails. There are people coming home from service, from
Absolutely.
The various areas of the world, injured. We have a lot of folks who were killed in the war, but we have even more people who came home with injuries, PTSD and other missing limbs, and others needed services. They call them wounded warriors.
Yes.
And now we have our forgotten warriors, those people who have other damage, rape and assaults and things, who have come home. So there's a number of arenas where people are coming home to, and all of these areas, people are coming home and ended up homeless.
Well, as you're saying that, what's going through my head is that in so many ways, people who are coming home from prison are wounded warriors as well. And some may come home, not have the challenges, may come home to not have the challenges, but once they get home, have the challenges because there's no one to receive them and they're not being able to move on with their lives. But let's segue now to look at leadership in education. As we begin to look at leadership in education and how it is impacting this crisis, there is a reality. There's a reality that's called zero tolerance. There's a reality that zero tolerance attaches itself to that's called the prison pipeline. Because we know that there's something called a cum file that attaches to a child once they enter into the public school system. And that follows that child, and that child, wherever they go to, if that teacher or educator or administrator begins to look at the file as opposed to looking at the child, something you mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of talking about formerly incarcerated individuals, that they build a frame around that child. So the reality that I want us to discuss is how can we check this reality of the zero tolerance in education that is causing so much of a challenge to make it better for our youth having a better chance of coming out and transitioning positively from high school to college or to career.
Something I've heard you say before, time and time again, we have to start with our babies. And particularly if we're looking at education, start with the babies at home and their families, but also start in kindergarten, looking at the teachers and the training that these teachers are getting so that they are looking at our children differently. So that when they're looking to become teachers, they have a plan in place to not just go into the classroom and collect a paycheck and monitor classes, but they have an ultimate, an outcome that they're working towards. And there are some programs around the country where a business or well-to-do individual might put so much money into scholarships and in order. We have some local charities, Orderly Brown Foundation, where they will pay for children to go throughout high school and actually go to college. And so we have to start looking at who these teachers are. How are they really supporting the children's growth? Is it just a matter of giving them tests, or are they really teaching them to think and to look at themselves as being individuals that will be successful beyond just passing that test?
Could we then, as I'm listening to you, something's coming to mind, could we, in checking this reality, actually take a look at how we measure our teachers? That test that we're doing right now, that's pretty much reality. We're trying to move away from it because we know it's not working. But could we check the reality and shift the paradigm in education as we begin to look at teachers who are able to keep the kids in their classroom? As opposed to the test, or the teacher who successfully graduates more students. And so the incentive then is not for a test grade, but the incentive is to not just send Johnny out because he coughed 3 times, but now he coughs 3 times, let's help him. Do you need something? Is there some way that I can help you? So if we begin to change, I think the lid, if the lid doesn't fit right on it, I don't know if I know you are familiar with mason jars.
Yes.
You put the wrong lid on, it won't work, right?
Right.
But when you put the right lid on, it just goes right on.
But a lot of resistance may come.
Oh, absolutely.
Because people,
resistance going to come.
because they say, I didn't go into teaching to become a social worker. I went into teaching to teach about, the ABCs and different things. But like you said, it's not working. And so we do have to look at teaching in a different way and look at outcomes in a different way so that it's not just whether or not you're passing the federal exam.
But for those who would have that pushback, did we not, I don't know if there's an oath, I don't remember, it's been a long time since I've taught in the public school system, and I don't remember if there was an oath or anything, but I think part of what we also should be committed to as teachers is to make sure that children are successful.
Exactly.
And if I have to shift a little bit, and in certain areas there may be a bit more social work that's involved, because at the end of the day, a child's success is not just going to be what happens at that school. A child's success is going to be based on what's happening after school, before school, in the time that school is not happening. I think that sincere, honest teacher who really is bought into the educational system will be interested in all that. We see it happening across the country where there are these teachers who are outside of the standard.
Yes.
And there are highlights about them. So it is possible. But I also hear what you say. There could be pushback, but I speak to that pushback and checking the reality that we need to push towards it, lean forward into the change so that we can begin to see the numbers change and we can check the reality as it pertains to the impact that it will have as we prepare our youth for wherever they're going to go. And we don't want that place that they're going to go to be prison. And with the system that exists now, we brought in this zero tolerance. Oh, it was going to be the thing that was going to change. We're just not going to stand for it. But it was, again, one of those things that seemed to be, based upon the numbers that we have in statistics, that the numbers are higher against our black and brown, and primarily our young men. Not that it is not also impacting the young girls as well, but it seems to always end up being that same number that comes in 2 to 3 to 5 times more than others that are being impacted by these negative policies.
Now, based on what you're saying now, I think we need to change how we are accepting some of these folks into the role of teachers. And there are a lot of people we're going to lose. But I'm not opposed to telling somebody, you might consider doing something different. Because what you're doing is damaging a lot of children and just being here monitoring and not teaching, being here putting things into a child's file that will follow them, and you have other teachers or other people who are just reading the file, as you were saying, rather than getting to know the child and seeing what that child needs.
You know, as I'm listening to you, Laura, it's amazing how things will come to mind when as you begin to chat about certain areas. I'm thinking in terms of our education, so we go pump it up even to what, you know, we talked about the training, but specifically some classes that may need to be developed in the teacher training around not just around diversity, but what are the expectations? What can you look forward to? Not the perfect little classroom where everyone sits in a row and does everything, but when things are outside of the norm, how do you handle those situations? And not having people that just come and are paid a certain amount if they stay in this particular area for 2 years, and they're just counting on, have a little cross off on the calendar. I only have 500 more days, or 50 more days, and not being committed to shifting the paradigm for the lives of the children so that they don't go into the system. So now let's take a look now, Laura. I mean, we could talk about that one all day, I'm sure. We'll come back to the education one, if you will. Let's look at leadership in the media. When we look at media in terms of how it pertains to the incarceration crisis, there's a reality. When you hear about incarceration, and you hear about people who are going to be placed into incarceration or people who have come out of incarceration, it's a pretty grim picture that's painted. There's also a pretty grim picture that's painted about what can be done. So where do we begin to check the reality so we can tell some of these wonderful things that are truly happening? You know, one of the things that readily comes to mind for me is who's in our journalism, who are our anchors, who are the people who are developing the programming in our mainstream media. And one of the things that comes to me, the way that we could check the reality, is to have more black and brown people. But then as I thought about that, maybe that would make a change, and maybe it wouldn't, because at the end of the day, the people that are in front of the camera are not necessarily the decision makers. So in terms of shifting or checking the reality, redressing the reality around media, what are your thoughts as to how programming might be changed, or as to how our journalists and anchors and people who go before, who have a lot of influence on how people see things, and how could we begin to check the reality in that area, knowing that in many cases what's happening in our media is that they're being driven by their viewers. You know, we know who's watching out in this area. This is who's watching. They don't want to hear anything about positive stories here because they think that all people who are impacted by incarceration are throwaways.
I think we need to start with places like where we are right now. You have Berkeley Community Media, and there are a number of community programs that are available for the community to hear what's happening, the real truth, the reality about what's happening. And I think if we could get some more folks who are re-entering and their families or other community people to come to a program such as this and sit down and talk about
the reality. I knew that's what you were going to say.
Then we can begin to change how it's being viewed in the community. See, we can't have as much of an impact on the other forms of media because they've been doing what they do for a long time, and they are driven by money, okay? And so they're going to continue to do it. But we have technology now. We have Facebook. We have Twitter. We have other areas of media.
That it will expand our voices, yes.
Exactly.
I love that.
And I think if we could get enough community groups, religious groups, individuals returning home to sit down and really learn how their voice can be heard through some of these avenues, then we can get more of the positive outcomes and the truth, the reality to the people on a different basis. Does that mean we don't try to get to the others eventually? No. But I say start with the community
Start where
papers.
we know we can make a change right now.
Community newspapers. And actually, you know, even some of our community papers won't touch certain topics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, you know, it's a great way to segue into the close. Believe it or not, we're running out of time. And that's why this is going to be an ongoing series for the next several shows, so that we can incorporate some of the things we want to make sure we cover. But I think I want to make sure that as our viewers are hearing some of the things that we've said, we've been tough on certain arenas, but we haven't spoken to what our role is. And so we must become a very cemented part of the voices that are heard about this crisis, and checking the reality around ourselves. Take an introspective look at yourself. What is it that you see or say about the crisis? You know, you see it and you say certain things, but at the end of the day, are you doing anything more than saying something? And then once you begin to see it differently, that you begin to think about it in a different way as well, Laura. As you begin to process these changes in you, that you take those things that you have either learned or that you thought and take it into a role of leadership to help expand it into our communities, to shift the paradigm, if you will, on leadership in media, leadership in education, leadership at the political level, leadership judicially, that we can all come together for the fundamental change that's going to be necessary to check the reality around this incarceration crisis. Together, Laura, we can make a change. I thank you again so much for being a part of this program. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you again next time on Stop the Madness, Practical Ways to Influence the Incarceration Crisis. Now go out and make this a great day. Do something good for someone else.